The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and the arts. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Paul Robeson, Jr. Paul Robeson, Jr. is the son of the legendary Paul Robeson, and in 1998, we'll have the 100th anniversary of your father, Paul Robeson Sr., right, my hero as a young man. So tell us, what are you and the Paul Robeson Foundation going to do to celebrate this remarkable man?
There are a number of activities, of course, going on around the country. The Paul Robeson Foundation, which was founded in 1996, is going to develop a series of celebratory events, and for the long range, a series of educational programs that will preserve and extend my father's legacy in a permanent way. Audiovisual archive, a vast array of print educational materials, audio, video, CD-ROMs, drawing from the enormous Paul Robeson and Islanda Robeson collections, which I own and which cover Dad's entire career, both his artistic life, political life, personal life, his writings.
And his athletic life.
His athletic life, which was quite extensive. That is, turns out he played with a team called the St. Christopher club team in Harlem beginning in 1917, 1918. It was one of the best teams in the country. It had three of the former Renaissance, the great Renaissance players, the Jenkins brothers and Tarzan Cooper, played with St. Christopher along with Dad. So he also played professional football with Fritz Pollard and others for 3 seasons. So he had a career beyond his college career as well, his All-American college career. So the collection and the exhibition, which is going to open on Dad's birthday here in New York, a retrospective exhibition on his life, the man and the life. It's called Paul Robeson, Bearer of a Culture. It's going to open at an ideal venue. That's the New York Historical Society, right here on 77th Street in Central Park West.
Well, you know, Paul Robeson was a hero to so many people of my generation. Of course, he's a hero to you, he's your father.
He was.
But in addition, he was this prototypic Renaissance man in sports and arts and politics and literature and linguistics and so on. And African-American youth, and I'd say some white youth throughout the country at that time, recognized that Paul Robeson was just a genius in everything he did and touched. And it's really a privilege to, in some little way, be associated with the 100th anniversary of his birth. And in your case, being his son, you must have tremendous pride.
I do, and I'm very proud to be able to say that aside from his greatness, he was a nice guy, and that's not always true. When he was with you, you remembered it. That is, he was with you completely. And he also was a great teacher. I worked with him for over a decade in some of the toughest years of his life. And he was a great teacher and a modest person. That is, if you did your job and you paid attention, did the best you could, not only did you learn a lot from him, but he was very gracious, and he had this capacity of compassion. I mean, I can remember messing up, according to his standards, a couple of times, enough to expect to be sort of ruled out of the human race almost, and he sort of looked down at me and smiled, patted me on the shoulder and said, "That's okay, you punished yourself enough, let's move on."
Let's move on. Yeah.
Whereas, other people would be chewing on you, how could you? But he had, among other things, a great insight into people and events. He was a thinker as well as a doer, a rare combination.
I had the occasion to meet your dad on a few occasions during my work as a political activist and social activist and so on, and in some artistic situations. And I was always impressed, as you said, about how gentle this large man with this deep voice was, and how he really penetrated and listened to what you had to say. And his responses to you were not just hello and goodbye, that he recognized you, but actually he was thinking about what you were talking about. And at that time, this was when America was in great trouble trying to decide how it was going to relate to Russia and the New World Order after World War II. And I was just always impressed with his strength and his dignity, and of course his intellect. He was a man of tremendous intellect, the way he could pick up those languages.
He did.
I just don't understand how anyone could do that.
Well, he was always a scholar, Roscoe. He would always travel on his tours. He'd always have a bag of books. He'd be studying languages and culture and God knows what. And he'd go away with one bag of books and come back with two. He was always picking up new information, always picking people's brains, always studying. And it's amazing now to look back to the 1940s, the late 1940s, the beginning of the Cold War and the days of the McCarthyism and the evil empire and all that. And Dad had a long-range vision. I remember him telling me as early as the 30s. I mean, he knew about the Stalinist purges and stuff like that. But it didn't deflect him from the main thing. He said, well, the only folks who are going to beat down Hitler are the Russians. So whatever Stalin is doing, you undercut him, we're all going to be speaking German. And he stuck to that. Despite taking immense abuse, how could you not denounce the evil empire and so on? The other thing he said way back then, when he founded the Council on African Affairs back in 1937, and he said, in a way, the Cold War has a strange benefit. You know, of course, he was for ending the Cold War because, you know, an atomic war would destroy the world. But he said there's a strange benefit out of that. Between the cracks of the Cold War, these two giants faced off, the third world is going to pop up in the middle.
I recall
so
him
it's
saying
not
that.
all bad.
Yeah.
It's not all bad. And he had this vision. And last but not least, I remember him telling me that his friends that he knew in the Soviet Union, even back in the 30s, people like Litvinov, General Tukhachevsky, who was executed as a so-called spy in 1937, and what he called the reform wing of the Russian Communist Party that survived somehow, the purges and everything else. He said someday these guys are going to come out of the woodwork and clean the country up. And when Khrushchev came to power, he said that's the last great peasant leader of Russia. The reformers are going to be standing on his shoulders. So he foresaw Gorbachev standing on Khrushchev's shoulders. So he always looked beyond the immediate, and he paid a very heavy price because he wouldn't go along to get along. He was always out of the stream and sometimes, of course, against the stream.
Well, talking about your father's life, he was born, I believe, in Princeton, in that area of New Jersey.
That's right, Princeton, New Jersey, 1898.
And that's the home of the great Princeton University. And somehow or another, he ended up at Rutgers rather than Princeton. Tell us about that.
Well, Dad always told me Princeton was almost like a southern town, very segregated. As a matter of fact, his oldest brother, William Drew, Jr., couldn't go to the Princeton High School and had to go all the way to Trenton to attend high school, 10 miles away. And Dad always said about William Drew, he was the smartest of the family, so you can imagine, but never could go anywhere because there weren't the opportunities for a black scholar then. And of course, Dad couldn't go to Princeton. It was totally segregated. And he always, whenever Rutgers played Princeton at anything, it was like a grudge match for him. He always wanted to beat Princeton because of his memory of Princeton being such a segregated town. Somerville and Westville, interestingly enough, where he went to junior high school and high school, were different towns. They were not as segregated, and they were heavily working class towns. And people were much more mixed up. In other words, yeah, the areas were sort of semi-segregated, but they were right next door. I mean, there wasn't this total division. So he said Westville and Somerville gave him an experience with white people as a young person where there wasn't always hostility, where there were friendships, where there was considerable interchange across the so-called racial barrier, which stood him in good stead when he became an adult. He had those positive experiences.
But when he went to Rutgers, he wasn't easily accepted, if I recall.
No, no, he had a tough initiation getting. As a matter of fact, the coach had to suppress a threatened strike by the varsity football players. They didn't want a black to try out, and he got beaten up pretty badly, but made the team despite that. As a matter of fact, the guy stepped on his hand in one of the scrimmages, stomped on his hand while he was lying down between plays, and next play he knocked the interference down and picked this guy up, and he told me, of course he wasn't going to maim him, but he looked so fierce, the coach thought he was going to break the guy in two. Oh, you're on the varsity, so he dropped him and walked away. But after that, having made the team, having been brutalized, but nevertheless made it, his teammates respected him from then on, and as a matter of fact, helped protect him when they played other teams, especially teams like West Virginia, where it was pretty tough. He became very much part of the team and respected by all the players. The coach, of course, was farsighted then, Forster Sanford, and saw in him not only a great football player, but a great man, and sort of was a mentor, almost father figure for him, taught him an immense amount.
He made two Walter Camp All-Americans. That's where the All-American teams were selected.
That's correct.
In 2 successive years,
1917 and 1918.
really almost unprecedented at that
right.
time.
That's right. And actually, you'd have to say in both those years, was the dominant football player in the country. He would have been the equivalent of a double, certainly a possible double Heisman Trophy winner, which for a black then was extraordinary. There were only, I think, in major colleges during his 4 years of play, maybe 4 black football players. I can name 2. One was Fritz Pollard, and the other, I forgot the name, a tackle out in Iowa. Duke Slater.
Duke Slater. Right.
Those were 2, and maybe there was one other, but that was it.
Now, he also especially excelled academically, and he was recognized by his peers for his academic accomplishments.
He did. He became a Phi Beta Kappa member in his junior year, which is unusual, and he made the Cap and Skull Honorary Society, and he was school debating champion in all 4 years. Debating team. So, and that's besides all his athletics. I think he won 14 letters in 4 sports: football, basketball, baseball, and track.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Today we're talking with Paul Robeson Jr., son of the legendary Paul Robeson. We're talking about Paul Robeson's heritage, particularly on this occasion of the upcoming 100th anniversary of his birth in 1998. Why did he go into acting and singing, which many of us felt was the bridge between the athletics and the political activism that made him a man of the world, as it were?
That's an interesting story. Actually, he was going to law school and had intended to go into law. He's going to Columbia Law School and fully intended to go into law. In his next to last year at law school, he did some work at a law firm, and he talked to black lawyers and people in law in general, but figured out that there wasn't much of a career for him. He could become a lawyer either within the context of the Democratic Party, sort of a Harlem or a black law figure in the political sense, but even in terms of arguing significant cases, major clients, corporate or otherwise, did not want a black lawyer arguing the case. So he had very little chance to go anywhere in the courtroom, and certainly not to rise to the top, say, appellate court judge or even Supreme Court judge was unthinkable then. So in looking around for something to do, he had sung a lot. He did little evenings of singing and so on when he was going to college to help pay his way through college. When he was going to law school, he did various gigs and some benefits for churches and so on, because he had this magnificent voice, which he developed in the church choir and singing in the church when he was a kid in his father's church, father was a minister. And he also was a natural actor, natural performer. But he considered himself an amateur until finally two people from O'Neill's Provincetown Players saw him in a play called Simon the Cyrenian, which was done by the Harlem YWCA, and they saw the talent. And at first he turned him down, but a year later he signed on to do Emperor Jones because Charles Gilpin had left the company, and the rest is history. He did Emperor Jones, and one of the things that happened is that in one of the scenes in the second act, the script calls for him to whistle, and he never could whistle worth a lick. So O'Neill, who had heard him sing at parties and whatnot with the Provincetown Players, said, "Paul, why don't you sing a song?" And he wrote in, "Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel?" So Dad sang a spirit and brought the house down. So what happened was he was a great success in both Emperor Jones and All God's Children Got Wings, two O'Neill plays. And then the Provincetown Players and Carl Van Vechten organized a concert of spirituals, which Dad did with Lawrence Brown, who happened to come back from London at about the right time. And again, they brought the house down. There was a repeat performance, and in 2 years, both his theater career and concert career were launched. And of course, the rest is history. Dad's impact in the 20s and 30s, but especially in the 20s, cultural impact was immense. He made the spiritual, black spiritual and art form on the concert stages of America and Europe in the 1920s. And he became one of the leading, if not the leading, black actor in the legitimate theater based on his portrayal of the O'Neill characters. So at age 26, 27, he was already a major Renaissance cultural figure, quite extraordinary.
You were telling me earlier about a performance he gave of Old Man River in the Warsaw Stadium, which you say is the absolute best. Now, why do you think that is the absolute best?
Well, first of all, there's a little anecdote, there's a story behind Old Man River and Showboat, because the part of Joe was written in 1927 for him by Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein II. They wrote the part for him. And he was not much on doing musical comedy. He felt too stereotypical. If he got stuck in that, he'd be permanently in the musical comedy kind of thing and never get to do concerts in legitimate theater. The problem was there wasn't much money in the concerts. You know, he was famous, but money was either in opera or in musicals. And finally, Mother, who said, well, and she was key in pushing him and helping him in his early career, both in the theater and the concert, she wisely said, look, you got to pay the rent. So doing the Showboat is not forever. You do one, you knock the hell out of the song, which is done for you. So he passed it up when it opened in New York, but fortunately he opened with the cast in London. And the rest is, again, history. He was a sensation. I mean, he just did Old Man River like nobody else. And as he went through his career, he changed the lyrics and the song, really, from a kind of submissive lament to a song of resistance. Even when he did it in London, people said there was some enormous dignity about the way he stood and sang it. It was quiet, yet it was powerful. It had this authority, this dignity, which kind of stopped the show. And it was so different from the stereotypical black image of the time, kind of the Sambo image, the kick up the heels, the ippy, smiling.
Thank you, Mr. Charlie.
Exactly,
right.
exactly. It was just and it had an immense impact on audiences, black and white alike, when they saw him. But he changed the lyrics as he went along. And so instead of, and originally the music is dedicated to him. So it's dedicated to Paul Robeson, and the lyrics actually, the original, are actually "Niggers all work on the Mississippi,
right.
niggers all work while the white folks play." And Dad changes to, "There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free?" Totally different feeling. And at the end, instead of, "I gets weary and sick of trying, I'm tired of living and scared of dying," he said, "I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying." And Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along. So the overtones were such that people from South Africa to anti-fascists in Norway,
The people in China.
the people in China picked up this song of resistance. So in 1949, the South African government banned the song in South Africa because South African miners were singing it when they were marching on their strike. And when the Nazis occupied Norway in 1940, they banned the song in Norway because Dad had recorded and sang everywhere the Norwegian national anthem, which is really a hymn. So he got himself, it's interesting, well, the Nazis on the one hand, the South Africans banned Robeson songs. In particular, the lyrics of Old Man River became a signature
And
song.
in this performance in the Warsaw Stadium,
Well, that was an interesting setting because here is this black figure, and the tradition in Poland is not exactly the most ecumenical folks. I mean, not to knock because there are great aspects of Polish culture, great, but at that time certainly a bit anti-Semitic, not too happy with anybody who's not Polish, and they hated the Russians, of course. So Dad came there, and first of all, he learned the song of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion. So he sang the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion song in Yiddish, which the sponsors, the leaders of the Communist Party, whatnot, were saying, okay, but then they whispered to him, "Hey, wait a minute, Robeson, you can get away with the Jewish song, but for God's sake, don't sing in Russian." Because he said, there's real workers out there. Yeah. This is not, they're liable to a riot. So Dad said, not to worry. So what he did is he spoke to them in Polish that he knew a little bit of, fairly well then, and said, "I need to explain my songs and so on, so the only mutual language we have is Russian, so I'll talk to you in Russian about the songs," and they took that. So he went along explaining the songs in Russian, and finally he sang a popular Russian song and they got up and cheered. So it's in that context when he ended the concert with Old Man River, and he was in magnificent voice that day, and he sang it a little lower than he usually did. And if any time I see the footage, it's extraordinary because he delivered it in such a powerful, dignified way, and he acted out the lines as he was going. And he had a good microphone system for this, amplification. And he just knocked the hell out of the song. The place went crazy because it linked their own Polish traditions, working class traditions of resistance to both occupation and to oppression, the Chinese, blacks, Jews. It sort of brought the whole thing together for this Polish audience who, for that day, really participated in a kind of ecumenical thing. I mean, they dug everything. They dug the Chinese, they dug the black thing, they dug the Jewish thing. So he kind of educated and lifted a whole audience. So it was an extraordinary interaction between the audience and him.
the 100th anniversary in 1998 gives an opportunity for the world to see and understand and learn more about your father, Paul Robeson. Mm-hmm. How do you think Paul Robeson himself would feel about conditions in the world if he were alive in 1998?
That's a tough question. He was an original thinker, so anything I'd say, he probably would figure out something better, or you would say. But I would say that he would be uplifted by the fact that there's been so much progress in areas that he pioneered. And it would be easier for him to see that than for us. We tend to see what's still to go, what's wrong, and rightly so, rightly so. I think he would, looking back over a vast time span, say, wow, we've come a long way. Now let's figure out how to go the rest of the way. And I think he would spend his energy not with nostalgia, or not with saying, oh boy, how great that I helped plow up the, but he would take the problems that we have now and focus on how can we move things forward now? How is it different from when I was around? How can we get a coalition that broadens out the base for progressive change in our country and the world? He would be, I think, very much into that, which I think especially African Americans as a people need to do. We have been too much into looking back with perhaps some nostalgia or whatever, when we need to really look forward, learn the lessons from the past, and apply ourselves to what do we do now and with whom. I think we can learn a lot from what Dad wrote and did and sang a generation ago.
As I said when I opened the program, Paul Robeson was a hero, a role model for many African American youth in my generation, and of course you. And I think the 1998 celebration of the 100th anniversary of his birthday gives us an opportunity to reinforce and to expand, and as you say, to look ahead, to face the challenges ahead, and to use some of the creative energies that's involved in meeting those challenges. Today on African American Legends, we've been talking about Paul Robeson Sr., an African American legend, with Paul Robeson Jr., and we've been talking about how this wonderful man will be celebrated in the 100th anniversary of his birth.